Okay, everybody, hello. One sec, make sure this is all good. All right, Dr. Rapich here from Vet Triage. We are going to be talking about horses today. We've got the October 15, 2016 issue of JAVMA that we're almost done with here. Risk factors associated with fatal injuries in thoroughbred racehorses competing in flat racing in the US and Canada. And this study comes out of Scotland. The objective is to identify risk factors associated with fatal injuries in thoroughbred racehorses in the US and Canada. It's a retrospective study. There were 1.8 million race starts by over 150,000 thoroughbred racehorses at 89 racetracks in the US and Canada from 2009 to 2013. Data was extracted from the Equine Injury Database, which contained information for 93.9% of all official flat racing events in the US and Canada during the 5-year period. Results found over 3,500 race starts ended with a fatal injury, resulting in a period incidence rate of 1.9 fatal injuries per 1,000 race starts. 22 risk factors were identified. Risk of fatality was greater for stallions than for mares and geldings, and increased as the number of previous non-fatal injuries and race withdrawals and level of competitiveness, meaning horses' winning percentage and race purse of the horses or race increased. All right. Introduction. Age, sex, race distance, racetrack surface type and conditions, race type, field size, meaning number of horses in a race, the season, prior racing history, distance galloped during training, exercise history, pre-race inspection by regulatory veterinarians, and horseshoe characteristics have been associated with fatal injuries. The Jockey Club was established in New York in 1894. Its mission was to improve thoroughbred breeding and racing in the US, Canada, and Puerto Rico. Results. Between 2009 and 2013, thoroughbred flat races took place at 144 racetracks. 37 had less than 1,000 race starts recorded. Collectively, data was extracted from this database for 154,527 thoroughbred racehorses that competed in 234,577 races at 89 racetracks. These horses account for over 1.8 million race starts, of which 3,500 resulted in fatal injury, making it 1.9 fatal injuries per 1,000 race starts. Those horses that had been competing in flat racing for 6 months or more were summarized. Horse-related risk factors. So they divide the risk factors here by horse, track, jockey, trainer, etc. So they're going to go through all these. Horse-related risk factors include sex, age at first race start, whether the race was a horse's first race, finish percentage, meaning finish position per field size, meaning a horse that finishes fourth in a field of 8 would have a percentage of 50%, whereas a horse that finishes 8th in a field of 8 would have a finish percentage of 100%. In whether the horse had been placed by an association or regulatory veterinarian on the vet list, the number of previous injuries, the number of previous scratches, and odds rank in the race, meaning a horse with an odds rank of 1 is the horse favored to win the race. The risk of fatal injury was increased for stallions compared with mares and geldings. The risk of fatal injury increased if the horse was on the veterinary list and as its number of previous injuries and scratches increased. Protective horse-related risk factors, meaning factors that decrease the risk of fatal injury, included the first race start and odds rank in race, meaning the risk decreased as horses become less favored to win. The risk of fatal injury also decreased as the finish percentage in the previous race increased. Racetrack-related risk factors. Here's another category of risk factors. One sec. So racetrack-related risk factors included country where the race took place, the racetrack surface, the race distance, the race purse. the risk of a fatal injury was increased for horses that raced on racetracks in the US compared with Canada, and it increased with turf, dirt or off dirt, meaning dirt in any non-fast, sloppy, or muddy condition surface, compared with tracks with a synthetic surface. The risk of a fatal injury decreased as the race distance and purse increased. Trainer-related factors, another category, included time with the same trainer, the number of days between races after a change in trainer. Both those factors were protective. The risk of fatal injury decreased as the number of months the horse was trained by the same trainer increased, and as the number of days between races after a change in trainer increased. The only jockey-related risk factor, so there's the final category, included in the final model was first start with a new jockey. The risk of a fatal injury for a horse in its first race with a new jockey was greater than for a horse in a race in which was ridden by a jockey who had ridden it in previous races. The risk of a fatal injury increased as the winning percentage up to 180 days before the race of interest increased. Interestingly, the risk of a fatal injury decreased as the number of race starts within 30 days before the race of interest increased, but increased as the number of race starts within 61 to 180 days before the race of interest increased. Okay. Discussion. Results of the present study suggested that the risk for fatal injuries, meaning euthanasia or death, within 3 days after getting injured, in thoroughbred horses that competed in flat races in the US and Canada during a 5-year period was increased for horses that were examined by a veterinarian right before a race or sustained previous injury. And that makes sense, right? If there's a previous injury, you're going to be more predisposed to problems. Racing a horse that was on the veterinary list was one of the risk factors for the highest magnitude of effect in another study. Additionally, that risk that a horse would sustain a fatal injury increased 3% for each time they were withdrawn from a race, which is called a scratch. Those findings concur with the results of another study in which horses identified as being at risk by regulatory veterinarians during pre-race examinations were 5 to 14 times likely to be injured or injury of the suspensory or superficial digital flexor tendon as horses that were identified as not at risk by regulatory veterinarians during pre-race examinations. So here you can see the anatomy of a horse, and the superficial digital flexor tendon is commonly referenced in this paper. And then the sesamoids being a problem also for these horses are common. So those are two anatomic structures there if you're not familiar with the anatomy. In the present study, the risk of a fatal injury was greater for stallions than for mares and geldings. Results of another study of deceased thoroughbred horses in California indicated that stallions are more likely than mares and geldings to fracture the proximal sesamoid bones of the forelimb. Over 80% of the fatal injuries assessed in this study were fractures. Stallions were also at greater risk of sustaining catastrophic musculoskeletal injury, non-fatal superficial digital flexor tendon injury, or any form of fatal injury compared with mares and geldings. Successful racehorses appear to be at an increased risk of fatal injury in the present study. Racehorses with a purse of less than $7,500 were protected against fatal injury, although the risk of fatal injury decreased as the race purse increased. Races with a low, meaning less than $7,500 purse, might have been a proxy for the quality of racehorses or lack of competitiveness, which may explain their apparent protectiveness against fatal injury. And that makes sense, right? The harder you train, the more you're a winner, the more stress on the body, and more likely you are to push yourself to the limits to where you hurt yourself. The risk of fatal injury decreases as the odds rank for a horse increase, meaning as the horse became less favored to win. In another study of thoroughbreds in Australia, the risk of serious musculoskeletal injury also increased as the competitiveness or race purse increased. In the present study, the risk of a fatal injury decreased as the number of race starts for a horse within 30 days prior to the race of interest increased, but increased as the number of race starts for a horse increased within 61 to 90 days and 91 to 180 days before the race of interest. This suggests that the risk of fatal injury increases for horses with over 1 month break between races, and is consistent with another study in which risk of horses sustaining a non-fatal superficial digital flexor tendon injury increased eightfold after over a 2-month break in racing. Results of another study also indicate that the risk of the superficial digital flexor tendon or suspensory apparatus injury was greater for horses with no race starts than for horses with multiple. Investigators of another study of thoroughbred horses in California reported that the risk of fatal skeletal injury was increased as the cumulative exercise and race distance during the 2 months prior to the race increased. The number of workouts or exercise sessions for racehorses is positively correlated with risk of proximal sesamoid fractures. So that makes sense. The longer you take breaks between competition, the more likely you are to be injured. And of course, if you run too many races in a row, also more likely to be injured. The risk of injury increases as the cumulative exercise increased. Another interesting finding of the present study was that the risk of fatal injury decreases as the time that a horse is trained by the same trainer increases. Compared with racetracks with synthetic surfaces, the risk of fatal injury was greatest for racehorses with off dirt and dirt surfaces, followed by turf. That finding is consistent with another study in which race-associated fatality rate of horses in California was greater for dirt tracks, followed by turf than synthetic. In that study, the race-associated fatality rate for racehorses with dirt surfaces was greater than for racetracks with synthetic, but it did not differ significantly from turf. And the fatality rate for racetracks with turf did not differ significantly from that of synthetic. The risk of fatal injury on racetracks with dirt was significantly greater than that of turf, but did not differ significantly from that of off dirt. The risk of fatal injury decreased as race distance increased and the field size decreased in this study. Results of another study of fatal fractures in the distal portion of the limbs in the UK also indicate a positive association between the risk of fatal injury and field size. However, unlike this study, there was a positive association between risk of fatal injury and race distance. Thoroughbred flat races in the United States and Canada tend to be shorter than those in the United Kingdom. Consequently, races in the US and Canada are run at a faster pace than races in the UK, and that fast pace likely contributed to the negative association between risk of fatal injury and race distance observed in this study. Investigators in multiple studies have reported a positive association between age and risk of injury. Age is highly correlated with age at first race start, and number of previous injuries. The incidence of fatal injuries in thoroughbreds competing in flat racing at 89 tracks in the US and Canada during this 5-year period was 1.9 per 1,000 race starts. That incidence was consistent with fatal musculoskeletal injuries in another US study, 1.2 to 1.96 fatal or catastrophic injuries per 1,000 race starts. And in South Africa, 1.4 catastrophic injuries per 1,000 race starts. The incidence rate of fatal and non-fatal injuries was 3.18 per 1,000 race starts in a study that involved 27 racetracks in Minnesota from 1987 to 1992. Regardless, the incidence rates of fatal injuries in thoroughbred racehorses in the US and the UK, 0.38 to 0.9 fatal injuries per 1,000 race starts. In Australia, which is 0.3 to 0.44 fatal injuries per 1,000 race starts. Moreover, the incidence rates within each jurisdiction or country remained fairly consistent since 1980s. We concede in this paper that statistical significance does not necessarily translate to clinical significance. Although we identified several risk factors that were significantly associated with fatal injuries in thoroughbreds, it is important to point out the vast majority, 1.8 million per 1.8 million, so 99.8%, of race starts evaluated in the present study did not result in fatal injury. Because of the large number of race starts evaluated and the resulting high statistical power of the study, the magnitude of effect for some of the risk factors was very small, and they should be considered during discussions regarding the selection and implementation of measures expected to have the greatest effect on minimizing the number of horses that sustain fatal injuries during races in US and Canada. Nevertheless, the study can be used as a guideline to identify racehorses at high risk of injury. So yeah, I like that the last paragraph really did make it, because my first thought was, well, if I'm an owner of a racehorse or a thoroughbred, I would just try and adjust for all these factors to maximize my chance of having a horse not kill themselves during a race. But they made it clear that it's a large number of cases, very small percentage actually have these issues. So, take that for what you will. All right, thanks for supporting the channel. We'll see you again tomorrow. Bye-bye.